Good evening, everybody, and welcome. For those of you I don't know, I'm Eric Cohen, the Executive Director of the Tikvah Fund, and it's really a privilege to welcome you to the second of these conversations with three of America's most interesting and important Jewish leaders, and certainly three pillars of Tikvah's work in Jewish life, Jewish education, and Jewish ideas. Last week, I had the privilege to sit down with our current chairman, Roger Hertog, one of the most interesting philanthropists, ideas, institution builders, and someone who gave a really moving account of his growth, his formation, his commitment as a Jew and as a Zionist. If you missed it, I really encourage you to get the recording of that conversation. Next week, I'll sit down with Ruth Weiss, longtime Harvard professor, courageous Jewish intellectual, and senior fellow at the Tikvah Fund. And tonight, it's really a privilege to sit down with Elliott Abrams, who I'll introduce in a moment, as Tikvah's incoming chairman and as one of the most important statesmen and leaders in the world of foreign policy and affairs and American public affairs. So what's the idea of this series? The idea of this series is that biography matters. When we teach classes to young people that we hope will emerge someday as Jewish leaders in the arena, we tend a lot of time studying statesmen, studying political leaders, studying figures that have led large and important and consequential lives, and the hope that the study of biography will give them models of excellence that they can emulate. We also think if you want to understand institutions, what drives them, their spirit, their purpose, their mission, you have to understand the people that shape them. And it's really in that spirit that it's a real honor to sit down tonight with you, Elliott, and have a conversation. I'm sure for most of you, Elliott Abrams needs no introduction. For more than 3 decades, he's been one of the most influential figures in American public life, and especially in the world of foreign policy. Whether it was the fight to liberate Soviet Jewry, the formation of Ronald Reagan's Cold War strategy, some of the most important policy issues in Latin America, the new Cold War that emerged, or the new war on terror rather, that emerged after 9/11, and certainly on issues related to the Middle East and Israel, Elliott has been an important voice. Less well known perhaps, though very important for Tikvah, is how much you've been a thoughtful and important thinker and analyst and leader on questions related to the future, the agenda, the strategy of American Jewry. So Elliott, we're honored to welcome you here. Elliott is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the chairman of the newly formed Vandenberg Coalition. And for us, we're thrilled to also welcome him as the incoming chairman of the Tikvah Fund. Elliott, welcome.
Thanks.
So I thought we would begin in the beginning with your early life. People's origins aren't necessarily their destiny, but they matter. And so I thought maybe you could give us a sense, especially of the Jewish world of your upbringing and how that shaped you, as well as the sort of cultural environment, the political environment of your earlier days.
Sure, and I think it is important for me or for anyone. I grew up in Queens, New York City, in a middle-class Jewish family. We were conservative Jews. That is to say, we belonged to a conservative synagogue. We were kosher at home. It's one of those great American patterns. Kosher at home, but not outside. And my father's parents were dead, but my mother's parents were very much part of my life. They were immigrants from Galicia, Yiddish speaking. We saw them all the time, and they were really a significant presence. I would say that we had a very strong Jewish identity. It's interesting and mostly ethnic, I guess I'd say, because it wasn't really tied to Israel so much, and it wasn't tied to Orthodox practice of Judaism. But we sure knew we were Jews. My parents inculcated that, not by teaching so much as by the way they lived their lives.
Was it really fundamentally an ethnic identity, or did this Yiddish-speaking environment of your grandparents bring with it a certain outlook, a certain value system, a certain carrier of a kind of culture, even if it wasn't embodied for you then in religious practice?
I'm not sure I can distinguish. I would have said ethnic. There was a sense that there were Jews, and then there was everyone else in the world. Jews, only Jews would protect Jews. Jews had to stick together. There were all of the normal characteristics, I think I'd say, of a middle-class Jewish family, meaning, for example, the enormous emphasis on education. in this context of kind of semi-suburban, non-Orthodox Jewish life, that meant secular education, not Jewish education, which was done at Hebrew school. But it certainly did mean, secular education and, college and after. I think it was mostly, though, an ethnic identification.
And what about politics? Did you grow up in a home where political ideas, political ideology was important, was sharp, was a significant shaping influence to you, or not really?
No, I would say my parents were, again, very kind of standard American Jews of the period. They were Democrats. They thought the greatest people were Adlai Stevenson and Eleanor Roosevelt, and they were anti-communist. That was very clear. My father was an immigration lawyer, and therefore, my life as a kid was full of people who had been his clients and became his friends, whose most desperate desire in life was to become Americans. So all of the anti-Americanism of the 60s and since really had no place at all in our lives.
We just taught a course for some of our younger students, a Tikvah class. It just struck me what you just said. And one of the things we had them read was an excerpt from Mary Anton's autobiography. And it gives this moving account of her as an immigrant child, so proud to have become an American, and this immigrant Jewish child. And so Washington was like the new Moses.
Yes.
And it's a powerful account of sort of the best of American assimilation. I've experienced myself and had the experience with others of American Jews who send their kids to day school, Jewish day school, for the first time, and it's like the whole experience in reverse.
Yes.
Like a return to Jewish identity that through the last many generations had been lost in the name of American assimilation.
It has been lost necessarily in the sense that, for example, so I grew up with Yiddish-speaking grandparents. Their English was not so great. They didn't really read English. I mean, they could read street signs, but they read the Jewish papers. By the way, they didn't read the Forward, the most famous American Jewish newspaper. They read the Morgan Journal, which is more conservative. So I have kind of yichus on the conservative side.
So it came from somewhere.
It came from somewhere. But my kids don't have that. And obviously grandchildren don't have that. There was, of course, an influx of Russian Jews when the Soviet Union collapsed to this country. But basically, American Jews don't have that. I mean, ethnic identity of that sort is disappearing fast.
It's a different era. So, like a good Jewish boy, you learn your way to Harvard. And it was there, right, when you first got involved in real political activism. So what drew you to politics in some way, especially foreign policy? And what were the fights then that you cared about?
I was always interested in foreign policy. That is, I was not interested in, economic policy, housing policy, something like that. And it led me to be active in an organization that's basically, I think, entirely gone now, Americans for Democratic Action, which was an anti-communist.
We're talking like the early 70s.
We were talking about, ADA was founded.
But I mean for you.
Yeah, for me it was 70s, right. Was founded by intellectuals like Arthur Schlesinger, John Kenneth Galbraith, and the labor movement, George Meany, David Dubinsky. Liberal anti-communism, which is where I thought I was. And I was attracted to Scoop Jackson, late Senator Henry Jackson, because he was as strongly supportive of Israel as anybody in American politics and of the Soviet Jewry movement. The Jackson Amendment on trying to free Soviet Jews. So that attracted me, and when I was actually in law school and Scoop ran for president in 72, I took some time off and worked on his campaign and told him, as you know, he did not win. And I told him, look, if you're going to run in 76, I want in. I want to come back. And did. That's what.
Why was Scoop Jackson such a influential figure on so many people? I mean, you hear over and over again, people of your generation who were drawn to him.
Right.
What was it about him that drew you to him as a political leader?
I think it was that at a time, now we're talking about after 1968, so it's the late 60s, the great cultural revolution, the 70s, McGovern. At a time when in the Democratic Party, a lot of people were weakening. A lot of people were cutting back. Were trying not to speak clearly. There was Scoop, who did not give a damn what the New York Times thought about him or the left thought about him, who continued to say what he believed, in particular on these foreign policy issues relating to the Soviet Union, to Soviet Jewry, to Israel. So I was one of the many Jews who were enormously attracted to this guy. And, it wasn't because there were a lot of Jews in Washington State. He believed in what he was saying.
So the Soviet Jewry movement, the effort to liberate, Jews trapped behind, the Soviet Iron Curtain, we look back on it as one of these sort of great moments of sort of Jewish activism in America. What were the lessons that you drew from that movement? Why was that so important to you then? And what is its legacy as you think about Jewish politics?
Actually at the Jewish Leadership Conference 3 years ago, I gave a talk about this. So now I've got to try to remember what I said. One of the lessons was that the American Jewish leadership, elite leadership, failed. All the great organizations came to this very late. You had Scoop Jackson out there, but a number of Jewish members of Congress early on, and a number of the great organizations really tried to say, you can't this is the US and the Soviet Union. Shh, Jews should not be interfering here. So one lesson was, don't listen to those elites. Just do what you think is right. They have no particular right to speak for the American Jewish community. Another lesson certainly was get organized. There is a community out there. It's kind of, if you build it, they will come. If you get organized, you will find people, this was true of the Soviet Jewry movement, all over the country who are willing to become more active because they care a lot, but they haven't had any way to show that they care. I think we also learned, stick to the principles. I mean, there were a lot of people saying, Jews should not interfere in U.S.-Soviet relations. That's what's really, you had Henry Kissinger saying it, frankly. That's what's really important. And what Jackson was saying and what the Soviet Jewry movement was saying was actually freedom is the most important thing. Stick to the principle of people's individual freedom, of their freedom to live where they want, of their freedom to practice their religion. What did these Jews want? They weren't trying to cause a revolution in Russia. They just wanted to go live in Israel. They wanted to learn Hebrew. And the lesson was that should not be sacrificed to some negotiation about missiles.
So in the Carter years, to borrow a phrase from someone that you and I both knew and admired, you were mugged by reality in a certain way. I think that's fair to say, right? And you end up serving in the Reagan administration. So what happened? Meaning, what was your assessment of the Democratic Party? And what was attractive to you about Reagan as a political leader? And what was sort of, not that we can get into too much depth, but the state of the Cold War at that point that you felt like you had to serve America in some way?
After 1972, when George McGovern was the Democratic nominee, Jackson and others tried to pull the Democratic Party back to where it had been. The party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and Johnson. In 1976, Jackson ran, but Carter, when he won, turned out to be promoting a foreign policy that was quite similar to the one that McGovern had talked about. I was one of a group of, let's call them hardline Democrats, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Norman Podhoretz, Admiral Zumwalt. There was a whole group who felt that we had not changed at all, but the Democratic Party was moving away from us. Actually, in 1976, we were invited to meet with President Carter at the White House, and we spent a half an hour with him. And that really did it. I mean, after that, I knew, okay,
That was the final mugging.
It was, and I think it was for Gene as well. Okay, we're going to be for Reagan. So I actually volunteered on the Reagan campaign. I really wanted him to win. And again, foreign policy was what I was really most interested in. It's why I came to work for Scoop. And actually, when Pat Moynihan was elected senator, I worked for him in his first 2.5 years as a senator. So it was clear to me that I wanted a foreign policy job in the Reagan administration, and I asked for one. And they said, yes. That was a lesson that Pat Moynihan taught me, actually. You don't get what you don't ask for. So I asked for the position of Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations, UN affairs. And Al Haig said yes. So there I was.
The round one in public life, or not round one exactly.
It wasn't right. It was round one in the executive
White
branch.
House life.
Right. It was the executive branch. And it was as fantastically interesting. I didn't have much to do. I had some to do in the first term of Reagan, when I was doing UN affairs and human rights. I did have something to do with Israel, because then as now, the UN has not changed, and Israel was being attacked every day in the UN, and being attacked on human rights grounds, among others.
So I want to come back to Israel and the public arena in a minute, but I want to shift gears a little bit. So in 1990, you're out of government.
Yep.
And an important study comes out, maybe sort of like the Pew study of its day, the Jewish Population Survey. And this really provokes you to try to make sense of the state of American Jewry. And so I'm curious, what was it in that study that you thought you had to grapple with? It eventually led to a book that you wrote called Faith or Fear. And I'm curious then, this is in the early 90s, what's your diagnosis of American Jewry? What moved you to care? And what was your analytical argument in that book, Faith or Fear, that was a kind of response to this assessment of the state of Jewish life in America?
I really can't answer the question of what moved me to care. I was a foreign policy person, right? This survey, maybe it was having children, which concentrates your mind and makes you think about the future. But this survey came out, and it's a series of facts. 1990 National Jewish Population Survey. And the question really was, what does it all mean? And I was reading about that. I was at the Hudson Institute after leaving the government. No one had a theory. No one was explaining this. You could show the numbers. Here are the numbers about disengagement with Israel. Here are the numbers about intermarriage. What does it all mean? And I thought, this is very interesting, and I actually think I can do this. Read it carefully, interview tons of people, read everything that was being written about it. And I did. And it seemed to me that the numbers that came out of that survey taught something. What they taught was, and this is 30 years ago, and I would say very little has changed, it's just gotten more so. What the survey showed, I think, was that the glues that had held the American Jewish community together, memory of the Holocaust and experience with survivors, ethnicity, the immigrant grandparents, anti-Semitism, were weakening or dissolving. There was only one that showed great strength, and it was Judaism. It was the religion. So you could distinguish between people who practiced the religion. Most were Orthodox, but particularly 30 years ago, you had many conservative Jews who were close to Orthodox in their practice, in their personal lives. This was not happening to them. All of these numbers were not affecting those who practiced the religion of Judaism. And I thought, okay, that's a simple lesson, actually, but I didn't see it being advertised, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book about this.
You didn't see it being advertised by the broader Jewish establishment.
That's right. I mean, for example, one of the things you learn from this is that education is critical. The Jewish day schools were having the impact that people who used them presumably wanted in keeping their children Jewish. Well, okay, then you'd think all of the great American Jewish organizations would say, all right, we need to reorient, right? We need to do massive fundraising drives. We need to open more Jewish day schools. We need to make sure that Jewish parents who want to send their kids to day schools and can't afford it are never faced with that problem. And none of that happened. None of that happened.
Why? What's your theory of why, when the answer in a way was clear? Meaning this analysis of what could preserve a meaningful, thick Jewish continuity. The Jewish establishment, the supposed leaders of their time, and you could argue ours, didn't change strategies, didn't shift gears, didn't mobilize for what could matter.
I think part of it was an ideology, which we associate mostly with the American Jewish Congress, but was a lot broader. The notion that there could be public support for Jewish schools or any other religious schools was anathema. And the American Jewish community had always, really pretty much always believed that, and had gone along with, I learned this all from Pat Moynihan, the Blaine amendments. These were the amendments that said no money, because they were trying to keep the money, Protestants were trying to keep the money from Catholic schools. This goes back 100 years. So part of it was a political position, an ideological position, that the government should not help. Part of it, I think, was assimilationism. That is, and I felt this growing up, that is, orthodoxy and day schools, we're past that. We're past that. That was for people who stayed behind, in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, not the people who moved to the suburbs. We were moving up. We were moving up in terms of class. We, American Jews, we were assimilating. Day schools would hold us back. That was not what was wanted. So I think, I think there was a almost immediate consensus among non-Orthodox Jewish elites and in the great organizations. No.
So let's go back. We'll come back to this a little later again, but let's go back to the foreign policy arena. So September 11th, 2001, the world changes. America finds itself in a war against terrorism, finds itself in a war where Islamic radicalism is an important dimension of it. It finds itself in a moment where the Middle East and its future and the rifts within the Middle East, including where Israel fits into that story, becomes central to the American foreign policy arena, but more broadly to America and its sense of its own civilizational prospects and challenges. So you go back into government, and I think I'm right. For the first time, the Middle East is really central to your portfolio. So what did you learn in that role? What was it like to be a Jew in that role? Did that matter? How did that shape your sense of America and Israel in the Middle East? That was an important time to be in that position. What did you learn there?
I started with George W. Bush handling, again, UN affairs and human rights. But I was very concerned about how Israel would fare in this world that you're describing. And I saw pieces of the bureaucracy saying to Condoleezza Rice, who was National Security Advisor, and passing on to the president, theories, impressions, takes on what was really going on and on what American interests were that I thought were all wrong. And I started to say to Condi, at the end of a meeting, I'd go see her in her office and say, pardon me, what you just heard happened didn't happen. That is not what happened yesterday in Israel. This is the Intifada, for example. That you're getting it wrong. I mean, what's being, and I mean, I wasn't looking for a new job, but in the second year of the administration, the person who'd been handling the Middle East left, and she said, "You're it." So I now did it full time. One of the things I learned was, we don't have, we all know this, but it's different to see it close up. We don't have cabinet government in this country. You want to know how Middle East policy is made? You want to know how policy toward Israel is made? It's made in the president's head. That's how. Policy toward Israel was made by George W. Bush. Yeah, people influenced him. I hope I influenced him. Condoleezza Rice certainly did. But you choose your advisors, and you choose who to believe. So one of the things is the people are critical. It's not just the president. I mean, think of George Shultz, the late lamented George Shultz, who was my Secretary of State for 6.5 years under Reagan, who had a deep appreciation of Israel and who, I think, more than anybody else, just simply really removed the lingering anti-Semitism from the State Department. After Shultz, it was gone. So this is, I think, an important lesson about top leaders. Individuals really matter. When I teach this stuff to, as I do intermittently, to Israeli officers who are coming over here for a week, to learn about America, I tell them, there's the institutional theory. It's the CIA versus the Defense Department versus the State Department, or it's the lobbying theory. It's AIPAC versus the oil companies. It's the evangelicals. And what I tell them is, in the end, it's not right. It's the president. I think it's also critical, and I learned this, that we be able to make these arguments about American national and national security interests clearly. For a very long time, it was obvious to most people involved in American foreign policy that you didn't want to get too close to Israel because the price was too high, particularly in the Arab world. But time after time, there was no price. I mean, actually, the Arabs didn't do anything after the United States backed Israel. So we've now evolved into a situation which nobody expected. And you may remember the very famous, you can look it up on YouTube, John Kerry's statement when he was secretary saying, if you think you're going to get peace between Israel and the Arab states without settling the Palestinian, never, never. And it happened. It happened because the Arabs had a better appreciation than many American statesmen did of where their interests lay. And looking at the Persians, if you will, from, as they often call them, and the Turks and the Jews in Israel, who have the Arabs chosen to be their ally? They've chosen the Jews. It's a lesson for U.S. foreign policy, because for a very long time, we chose the other way. I mean, Eisenhower obviously chose Nasser in Suez in '56. He later said it was one of the great mistakes he'd made as president. So one of the lessons, I think, is that there is a great American national interest in backing strong allies, such as Israel. And we should not be afraid to say that. In fact, it's a striking thing about President Bush, though he wasn't the first to do this, that the person he asks to do this job is a Jew who, is obviously feels very strongly about Israel, and he never saw why would that be a problem.
Did you ever feel a tension? Meaning, on the one hand, being a high-level American official, helping to manage the portfolio of Israel and the Middle East on the one hand, and on the other hand, a committed Jew concerned about the interests and destiny of the Jewish people. Did you ever feel a tension?
I did not. I can tell you that at that point, it's 15 years ago now, I know that the Saudis viewed me as likable, intelligent, competent Israeli agent, and couldn't figure out why Bush didn't see that. I didn't, not with Rice, not with Bush, not.
So you're saying that wasn't true?
It was not true. Let's put it on the record.
Get that on the record.
Put it on the record.
Saudi theory was not true.
It's not correct. I did not. Not with American officials and not with Israeli officials either. I really thought this is. I have a conception. More importantly, the president has a conception of American national interest. Now, if he had had a different conception, which was that Israel is a big problem and we need to distance ourselves from Israel, which is what President Obama said, I wouldn't have been in that job because I really did not believe that. And he would, finding out that I didn't, he would have at some point gotten rid of me. But maybe I was lucky to have a president who deeply appreciated the nature of Israel and the value of Israel as an American ally.
So as you think about Israel, as you think about America's posture toward Israel, where do American Jews fit in? What about how have the attitudes of American Jews evolved, the influence of American Jews, the interests of American Jews as they think about Israel questions? How has that changed in the last few decades as you've been involved in these issues? And what's your assessment of American Jewry today vis-a-vis the Israel question?
It is changing, I think, a lot. I think for a long time, Israel was a charity case for American Jews. And the charity was very important. I mean, there are years when the Israel bond, just take one, Israel bond sales are equal to about 25% of the entire defense budget of Israel. We then reach a point after the 67 to 73 wars where, again, we far outnumber the Israelis, we American Jews. I mean, in 1948, there were 650,000 of them, 5 million of us. Obviously, that begins to change. But in the 70s and 80s, we begin to give the United States begin to give large amounts of military aid and economic aid, billions in economic aid to Israel. This is all changing, I think, right now. Israel, which was isolated in the whole world, no Arab state would have anything to do with it. Israel now has relations with lots of Arab states, many openly and some secretly. Israel's getting a bit rich. Israel stopped in the 90s getting American economic aid because it didn't need it. The aid we do give, military aid, is of course a decreasing percentage of Israel's GDP. Numbers. There are now about, let's say, 7 million Jews in Israel. There are not 7 million Jews in the United States. I mean, Pew has some strange definitions that resemble mostly the Nuremberg laws, frankly, as to who is a Jew. But it's clear that that's changing. I think the interesting question going forward is really the one you asked. If the American Jewish community is declining in size, and I would argue that it is, and in some parts in vitality, what is the role of Israel? We think of Israel, Israel is very important for, Australian Jews. What about American Jews? What about American Jews a generation from now and 2 generations from now? What is that relationship going to be like? It is certainly not going to be a relationship of dependence in the way it has been for most of the time since 1948.
I mean, going back for a minute to your sort of faith or fear analysis, that religious Judaism, Jewish practice, is the most reliable, perhaps the only reliable carrier of Jewish identity in the current era. What do you make of the efforts to make attachment to Israel a kind of savior or redeemer or, preserver of Jewish identity among American Jews? Obviously, Birthright Israel is one of the most prominent things. There have been other, I would say, noble efforts, important efforts to try to deepen the connection of American Jews to Israel. Is Israel attachment another source of rich Jewish identity for American Jews? Do you think that's working? Do you think it can work?
Not alone. I don't think so. I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think there's a real question about birthright. It's been phenomenally successful in getting young American Jews to Israel. But what about the follow-up? Do we know what happens 5 or 10 years later, or is it a trip? And there again, I'd say it's great. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm fully supportive, but alone, birthright won't do it. Israel will do it for some percentage of American Jews. I mean, some people will, kind of fall in love with the place. I'd say the same thing about Hebrew language. Will Hebrew language keep people Jewish? Alone, it won't. The only thing that alone will do it is Judaism, I think. It's the practice of the religion. Pew has, there's one other thing that'll keep people Jewish, by the way, being Israeli. Pew has a fantastic, they invented a category for these surveys called Jews of No Religion. Now, the fact is that Jews of no religion drift away and their children drift away. So after a generation or two, they're not Jews. That doesn't happen in Israel. I know lots of secular Israelis. Their children are Israelis. So whether they practice the religion or don't practice the religion, it doesn't matter. They're not going to fall away, assimilate into, the sort of Americanness, or for that matter, Christianity. But we don't live there, we live here. And that doesn't work here. Now, if you had a child and you raise the child in a Jewish home and not particularly religious, but you go to Israel every summer and the kid goes to Jewish camp and the kid learns Hebrew, is that, yeah, I mean, that, there are a lot of formulae that are bound to work.
So what you're saying, I think, is these efforts to get American Jews, including those who have not had a very thick Jewish upbringing, to go to Israel, that's obviously a great idea. It could ignite something, but it's not alone means it's that experience of Israel plus ongoing Jewish education. Is that the thesis?
I think that's right. I would say the same thing about summer camp. I would say the same thing about learning Hebrew. In the charters, there are some Hebrew charter schools. I don't think that any of them alone will work the way day school or the practice of Judaism works. Again, we're not talking about one particular family or another. No one knows the fate of one small group of children, but one knows the statistics, and the statistics show us that the Orthodox retain a much greater percentage of their children. And we know that day schools are also associated, and not just here. They're associated in Canada and Australia and France, England, with a much greater retention rate than we get here with this or that aspect of it, but without those central, what can we call them, glues to Jewishness, to Judaism, to Jewish identity.
So let's talk about Tikvah for a minute. Roger Hertog announced a week or two ago that he's going to be retiring after 20 years as the chair. And we're all thrilled that you're going to be the incoming new chairman. I'm sure Roger didn't tell you, this is basically a full-time job. He left that out so you'd accept the role. But why are you doing this? Meaning you have important books to write, you're an important voice on American foreign policy. You've just launched the Vandenberg Coalition, an effort to kind of rally a sense of American responsibility in international affairs. Why invest the time and effort, my charming personality aside, in taking on this role as chairman? What does this mean to you? Why do you think it's important?
A couple of things. One, I'm going to have to look back someday and say, how did I spend my time? Now, I've spent 20 years in the U.S. government over time, from Reagan to Trump, and I consider those years very, very well spent. But this is an enormous and deep interest of mine. What have I done to help strengthen the American Jewish community? If I care about it, and I do, I'm an American Jew, I care about my children, my grandchildren, but also the broader community. Now, there are other things that one could do that, based on what I just said, doesn't work, I wouldn't do, because I think they're not fundamentally part of the answer. But Tikvah is. Tikvah is, first of all, I think, strengthening a community that exists, a kind of community of ideas, an intellectual community, through things like Jewish Review of Books and Mosaic. The educational programs are absolutely critical. They're critical for the day school students who are getting them, because it is elevating, I think, the educational level that they are getting. It is challenging them in ways that many day schools don't. And for the non-day school students, they're being offered something I wasn't. My Hebrew school education was pathetic, and I actually think most American Hebrew school education is still pathetic all these years later. We are offering kids, and now courtesy of Zoom, all over the country, not just a very small group that, has to gather in one place, the riches of Judaism and Jewish history. I think people can look at, what are these courses? What is being offered? If you are an intelligent Jewish kid, and you have any interest at all, you're going to be swept away by this, because you are going to learn about something that no one else is teaching you, about the history, the culture, the religion of the Jews. And I think that it's something that's critical, because look, the fact is, most Jewish kids don't go to day school. And 10 years from now, that's still going to be true, unless there's a constitutional revolution. And we need to reach out to both groups, I think. Because what we're doing, in a sense, we're not educating 1 million Jewish kids. We have a chance to help build, to help bring back, to help educate people who are going to lead in the Jewish community 10 and 20 and 30 years from now. I don't think anyone else is actually doing it, or doing it this way. So when Roger said to me, you have to do this, it's funny, because for those who have seen the talk you had with him, Zalman Bernstein said to him, you have to do this, and it will be the best thing you ever did. Basically, Roger used the same line on me.
Jedi mind
we used
trick
it, and it worked. It worked again. Because I think it's true. I think, and I have to tell you, after Roger sent out that email, I got, of course, lots of emails myself. And many were very nice, congratulations, you're the right guys. But many said, I can't tell you, I'm 5 years out of university, I can't tell you what Tikvah meant to me. I can't tell you how Tikvah changed my college experience. I can't tell you what Tikvah has meant to me now. I can't tell you how much Tikvah has changed my daughter and my son who are taking Tikvah courses. It was really fantastic to get a significant number of these. So that's my way of saying it's working. It's what Roger and you have built here is, I think, a fantastic institution. It ain't broke. We don't have to fix it, but we do have to carry it on, because, again, you go back to the new Pew data. There are many ways in which the American Jewish community is weakening. So we are trying to strengthen it in different ways, and it's as maybe more important than ever that we do this and that we succeed at it.
So if you were to try to distill, and we've in a way touched on many of these themes, but what should the American Jewish agenda be? Right? I mean, you in a sense looked at this in 1990, and there was an obvious demographic, cultural crisis of continuity, but there were also insights about what can work. Now we're 30 years later. You're in this role as chairman of Tikvah, which is, a significant Jewish organization now. What should American Jewry's strategy be? What are the key things we need to stand for, fight for, try to build, whether in the policy arena or in the institution building arena, cultural arena? What's at the top of that list for you?
This is a very hard question. a fateful question for the community. One piece of it, I think, is the community has to rethink education. We have many American Jews who send their children to day school, and it kind of ruins their lives financially. We have many others who have to move from one place to another because of that expense. We have many others who would love to do it or would consider it, but the finances are prohibitive. Again, that doesn't happen to Canadian Jews and Australian Jews and French Jews and British Jews, only American Jews, because we have this model. First of all, that the government can't give a nickel, and the community is not terribly supportive for all those old ideological reasons. That's got to change. There are very large Jewish fortunes in this country, tens of billions of dollars, and I think one of the things we need to do is to pay much more attention to the way in which the country, the society, and the Jewish community think about the financing of education. Because we can do what the British and the French and the Australian and Canadian Jews are doing. We can have a community in which anybody who wants that for their child can afford it. So I think the educational part is really quite critical. Even if we do that, we are going to need to do what Tikvah is doing, which is to raise the educational level. It's not very good in too many parts of the American Jewish community. It's okay, or it's mediocre, or it's not okay. But, you know, it's a strange thing, because American Jews, like other Jews, have this fantastic value of education. We talked about this in the terms of the immigrants, and we do. So you had this amazing development where after the Second World War, you know, look at the Ivy League, look at the great small colleges, look at Berkeley and Michigan, Jews and Jews and Jews. All these places are 30% Jews, 40% Jews, because of this demand for the best quality education. But not when it came to Jewish education. It's bizarre. And this, I think, is a great task of the Jewish community, but it's a great task of Tikvah, because the material and the teachers are there. It just has to reach a lot more people. So I start with education. I think the American Jewish community has to think long and hard about the society in which it is living. Because we have seen this growing anti-Semitism recently. It's got to be examined. It's got to be thought through. What is the kind of politics in the country that led to this? What happened? Why did this happen now? I am not talking about this in a partisan sense. I am talking about this in a community sense. We need to think about how does the community react to anti-Semitism, and what are the kinds of people and leaders that we ought to be supporting and opposing. What are the kinds of thinking, what are the kinds of ideologies that threaten Jews? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we really didn't have to have that conversation. But I think there are now loose in the land ways of thinking that actually do threaten Jews.
How do you think about the relationship between American Jews and American Christians, especially the evangelical community? Is that an important strategic issue for American Jewry?
Actually, Ron Dermer, the former ambassador, spoke about this recently. We said, you know, evangelicals are, in his way, a more important target than American Jews. Over the last generation, evangelicals have been a critical piece of the coalition supporting Israel. They still are, a little bit less so. The most recent data on evangelicals shows younger evangelicals, like all younger Americans, including younger American Jews, are less supportive of Israel and less engaged. So it ought to be a great concern. There are actually more evangelicals in the United States than there are Jews. You may not have known this.
This is breaking news today.
So it's critical for the support, the Israel, let's call it, coalition in the U.S. I read the book of Exodus as having one central lesson, which is that ingratitude is bad. In that case, it's ingratitude to God. The American Jewish attitude toward the evangelical support for Israel has been, in my view, ingratitude of an epical, almost religious dimension, suspicion of them, rejection of them, when they have been so supportive of the state of Israel. That should change. In parts of the community it has changed, but it's going to be an important part of support for Israel.
I mean, it would seem beyond the question of Israel, which is obviously important. It would seem, going back to what you were just talking about in the educational arena and the importance of religious identity, that the interests of religious Christians and of committed Jews are also aligned when it comes to the preservation of religious freedom, and certainly when it comes to the idea that religious families also should have the freedom and therefore the resources to give their kids the educations that they want. And, you know, I think the Christian community faces its own continuity crisis, right? Without religious formation in schools within the Christian world, they face the same kinds of challenges that the Jewish community faces. It would seem to me that should be the basis for a deeper alliance and friendship that has been formed. And it also seems to be a place where Jewish interests and the interests of American civic life are also aligned.
Well, this is a critical point, I think. We have been living on capital that previous generations built up about the place of religion in American life. And we kind of inherited it. I mean, something happened after World War II and the Holocaust. Will Herberg's famous book, Protestant Catholic Jew, summarized it. Judaism became one of America's religions. Things are changing in the sense that religion is now, I would argue, under attack in America. You see, for example, these famous Supreme Court cases about a baker who, because of his Christianity, doesn't want to bake a cake for weddings, gay weddings that he doesn't believe in. And a lot of Jewish organizations immediately denounce the baker. There is a kind of clash about the protection of religious freedom. It didn't happen 40 or 50 years ago. We had some of these great cases about religious freedom in the Supreme Court. But we're now going to get another series of cases because there are other clashing rights claims. That has the potential to harm American civic culture and religious culture. And it will hurt religious Jews, and it will hurt religious Christians, and it will hurt religious Muslims and anybody else.
It will also hurt any Jews and any Americans who believe in the idea of liberty, many who believe in the idea that, you know, creating a protected space where communities of faith can live in accordance with their own ideals, whether more traditionalist or more progressive, that is a part of the American idea. And Jews, of all peoples, it would seem to me, should be a leading voice in that religious freedom fight.
We should be. We haven't had to be for many decades because the fight really wasn't underway.
Right. This seems to be a new moment.
It is. The fight was against anti-Semitism for many decades and for being accepted as real Americans. Right. We're decades past that. And now the question is not about Jews. Now the question is, though it greatly affects Jews, is what is the role of religion and what are the dimensions of religious liberty in America? You know, the First Amendment protects freedom of religion and the practice of religion and religious expression. It protects everything you do in your religious life, or at least that's the way it's been thought of in America. And if we're going to move to a new definition of religion that says, well, go to synagogue, but outside the synagogue, your religion is unimportant and other claims are going to take precedence. That's a different America. That they're not. Yeah. If those claims are not protected, if the practice of your religion, the way Judaism is supposed to mean, which is a way of life, not just a religious service on Shabbat, then liberty in America and religious liberty in America for practice of any religion really is under threat.
So I open the evening by saying why we think it's so important to teach biography. The idea being that if part of your aim, part of Tikvah's aim, is to try to educate future leaders, you want to expose young people to models of excellence in history, and then also encounters in their own lives with current leaders that they can learn from. Not mimic, but learn from. So you mentioned Scoop Jackson, you mentioned George Shultz. You know, as we bring our conversation tonight to closure, I'm just curious, are there any figures in history or in your own experience, biographies, people that you've studied, people that you've worked for, that have had a defining influence for you as sort of models of excellence that you've tried to emulate and you know, carry forward in your own distinctive way, you know, as a public figure, as a leader in American life and as a leader in the Jewish community? Is there any one that you would point to as having been transformative or deeply influential for you?
There are a few people I think I would mention, in addition to Schultz. There's George W. Bush, who, if you think back to 9/11 and what came after it, carried the world on his shoulders. Really the world. But for those of us who worked for him, he did not then crush us. He carried it on his shoulders and conveyed the sense of seriousness and dedication, but also conveyed that, you know, I am up to this task. And he conveyed it to the American people, and we are up to this task. There's someone I, you know, like all of us, admire, and that's Natan Sharansky, who, you know, you look at it and say, is this a great man? Doesn't look like a great man. One of the greatest people of this century and the previous century, a man of unbelievable courage, but who wears it so lightly. He's just, you know, an astonishing figure in the history of, I think, of Israel, in the history of Judaism, in the history of liberty. I would also mention Ariel Sharon, because Sharon, I think, also showed an incredible degree of courage over long periods of time to differ with everyone around him, to take a different view, a different path, and keep fighting for it and keep coming back to it. I had the opportunity to spend a fair amount of time with Sharon when he was prime minister, and I was in the White House, and talked to him sometimes one-on-one or two-on-two, and hear really about his life, about his childhood, about, you know, how he viewed himself as a Jew, not just as prime minister of Israel. And he did view himself first as a Jew. I think all of them really had an impact on me. And I would not say I mimic them and certainly don't live up to them, but I think these are, for me, in many ways, models or standards of excellence that remind us what an individual can actually achieve in life. And these are certainly people whose achievements were spectacular.
Well, look, if there's one idea that we try to convey to our students, it's the idea of Jewish excellence, that means something. That whether that's in intellectual life or political life or religious life, that we should try to find models from history or in our lives, and then as young people, hopefully be inspired by them to carry them forward. And I know over the years, you've taught for us many times, and I know you've been a model of excellence for our young people. And I would say on behalf of the entire Tikvah community, and it really is a community and a growing one, I just want to thank you for taking on this new role as chair. Don't be too hard on me, you know. But be hard enough so that we hopefully as an institution can, in our own ways, advance Jewish excellence. So, Elliott, thank you for opening up tonight, reflecting a little bit on your own life and career, and hopefully it will be the beginning or the continuation, not the beginning, of important work together.
Thank you. It is a great, great honor to be asked to succeed Roger as chairman. And I will do my best to continue what you guys have built, which is really a great Jewish institution.
Elliott, thanks. And to everyone else, have a good evening.